Hi everyone, welcome to the AATRN seminar. The speaker today is Adélie Garin, and she's gonna tell us about, well, the title of her talk is From Trees to Barcodes and Back Again.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. So what I'll be presenting today is some work on the inverse problem of trees and barcodes, as you can see in the title. And I'll be mainly giving combinatorial and geometric perspective and a few statistical ones as well. This is joint work with a bunch of people because it's a compilation of several papers that I've done during my PhD at EPFL. So with Benjamin Brook at ETH, Justin Curry and Jordan Desha in Albany, Lila Canary, Catherine Hess at EPFL, and Brendan Mallory, who's now in Tufts University. So the first motivation for this talk is, well, trees and barcodes, and mainly trees. So you may know merge trees as a tree that summarizes the connected components of the sublevel set of a function. They can also be used in the more combinatorial definition that I will give later in this talk to model anatomical trees, like neurons, for instance. And so if you want to study distribution of trees, sometimes it's, well, most of the time it's quite difficult. So using barcodes to study trees is a good tool. It has been used, for instance, in this paper with application with neurons to classify different types of neurons that, well, for two types, two neuroscientists did not really agree on whether they were the same neuron or not. So that's useful for classification. And also to understand how those trees that we can see in nature may be different from random trees. The other type of tree that I will briefly mention in this talk is phylogenetic trees. They're used to study species ancestry and also for classification purposes. They're a bit different from merge trees, so I will just wanted to mention that in my talk so that people who use one or the other may be able to recognize next time the differences. The second motivation is the inverse problem. So when you can compute the barcode from a tree, and we try to understand the relation between the spaces of trees and the space of barcodes, and how we can go back from the barcodes to the trees. And the goal is to try to combinatorially characterize this relation. Also to build new statistical tools. So we started by trying to understand the set of trees that have the same barcode, and we realized that this has useful application. And we used it to understand biological trees, so neurons, and how they differ from random tree structures, as I just stated. So this is a little bit of a drawing to summarize this inverse problem. So if we have the space of trees, we can have a subset of trees that have specific properties, so a distribution of neurons, for instance. And we're trying to understand that, but it's a little bit difficult to do it in the space of trees. So we project that down to the barcode space, where we end up with a distribution. We can do some analysis here. And then the question is, how do we go back? This is kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So the outline of my talk, I'm first going to give definitions of trees and barcodes, just so that we're all on the same page. Then I will, again, very briefly go over persistent homology and how we can compute the barcode from a tree, and explain how we can use the symmetric group to classify barcodes. And that will turn out very useful for this combinatorial characterization of the inverse problem. So from barcodes to trees, the reconstruction problem. And I'll explain how we can use the symmetric group as a statistical tool. And then I'll give the combinatorial and geometric perspectives of this. So I will explain how we can give a new geometric description of the space of barcodes with n bar based on some geometric group theory tools. And hopefully I'll have time to mention a lattice theoretic version of this inverse problem. So just for the definition, so we're all on the same page. For me, a combinatorial tree is an acyclic finite binary graph with a distinguished vertex that we call a root. So these two trees are the same because the adjacency matrix says that the blue, red, and purple bars are all attached to the white one. It's the same thing here. So they're the same combinatorial tree. A merge tree, so the space of merge trees with n bars, I will denote by mtn, is a combinatorial tree with a height function on the vertices, so this function f, and we just want the function to respect the hop distance to the root, so that it really does like a height function. So you can think of a Morse function if you're familiar with that. And again, just to mention briefly phylogenetic trees and the difference with merge trees. So a phylogenetic tree is a combinatorial tree with a labeling on the leaves. So here the label is the color. So this time the order of the bars here matters, not like here. And if we want a metric phylogenetic tree, we also add this height function on the vertices. So the big difference between a merge tree and a metric phylogenetic tree is really this labeling on the branches, which makes actually a huge difference when you try to study the space of these trees. So from now on, when I say a tree, I mean a merge tree. So a merge tree, just again to have the terminology, the leaves are the vertices of degree 1. The bifurcation or internal nodes are the one of degree 3 here. This is the trunk and this is the roots. And just a small remark, merge trees, they also inherit a labeling on the leaves, but this is really inherited from the height function. You can't give it any label on the branches. So here it would be 0 because it's the first one. So the trunk will always have 0, then 1, 2, 3 in the order they appear with this height function. And a barcode for me is just a multiset of pairs of birth and death that starts at 0 again for the trunk, the main branch. And I will denote the set of barcodes with n plus 1 bars because we will sometimes not consider the main branch to the trunk. So the n or n plus 1 depends on the context, but by bn. And we call the barcode strict if the trunk, so the main branch or the largest bar basically contains all the others, and if all the birth and death values are different. And because all the births are different, we can, without loss of generality, order the bars by birth time. So a barcode for me will look like this, with the birth ordered. Now you're probably all familiar with persistent homology. So it takes a merge tree with n plus 1 here bars. Generic is to say that all the values of the function on the vertices are different. And it will return a strict barcode because all the values are different. The birth and death will also be different. And well, you can either take the very functorial approach of persistent homology, but for here, we're just considering the 0th homology. And there's a much simpler algorithmic way of seeing this. Basically by the elder rule, when you have two branches that merge into each other, you just say that the one that was born before stays, so the blue one here, and the green one dies, merges into the other one, and that's how you obtain the barcode. So I guess everyone's familiar with that, but it's easier to see this with this more algorithmic version here. And even though we can, I will always order the bars by birth, just remember that a barcode is really just a set of pairs, so it's unordered, and I will get back to this at the end. Now, the first new definition of this talk is a combinatorial merge tree. So it will be just a combinatorial tree with an ordered labeling of the leaves. So I will call that a birth label, and an ordered labeling of the internal nodes. So I'll call that a death label. And we just want this death label to respect the ancestor relation. So for instance, these two are combinatorially equivalent merge trees. Here are the labels. And you can see that the total order of the vertices is not the same. So here we have 0, 1, 2, 1, 2, and here we have 0, 1, 1, 2, 2. But they're still combinatorially equivalent merge tree because if you just consider the leaf nodes, the order is preserved, and for the internal nodes, the order is preserved. So death and birth labels are preserved. And this will be enough to completely characterize the inverse problem, so the fiber of the persistent map, if you want. Now for a straight barcode, if we suppose that the birth ordered, so what I will define now does not depend on the birth being ordered, but it's just much simpler to define it like this, because we just consider the order of the death, and the permutation sigma that tells us the order of the death is what I will call a combinatorial barcode. And with an equivalence, if we say that two barcodes are equivalent if they have the same death order here with respect to the birth order, then we obtain a bijection between the set of strict barcodes quotiented by this equivalence relation and the symmetric group, which is indicated by this permutation here. So between the space of strict barcode and the symmetric group. So we can characterize a barcode by the permutation where the ith death is sent to the jth birth. To give you an example, here the first death corresponds to the third birth. So we have 1 sent to 3. The second death corresponds to the first birth. So we have 2 sent to 1. And the third death corresponds to the second birth. So we have 3 sent to 2. And this gives me the permutation 3, 1, 2. I will denote permutation by the image of 1, 2, 3, just so that we know that really corresponds to the order of the death. So here, 3, 1, 2. So this is what we call a combinatorial barcode. And basically, using these two definitions of combinatorial merge tree and combinatorial barcode, we can completely determine this problem of merge trees to barcodes. So we have the elder rule that takes a merge tree and gives you a barcode. If we consider the corresponding combinatorial merge tree here and the corresponding permutations to the combinatorial barcode here, then basically this map here becomes a combinatorial elder rule. And this is enough to get all the information of what happens up here, apart from the real value of the function, but this can be decided later. So you can see that here, the label of the birth, so here we have the first label, is sent to the second label. So we have 1 sent to 2, and then 2 here is sent to 1. And that is my combinatorial elder rule. So just using the symmetric group, we can completely characterize what kind of trees we have, combinatorial merge trees. I will get back to this in a bit. So now we have the problem of if we have a barcode, how many trees can we reconstruct from this? So, I mean, it's quite obvious for probably many people here that it's not injective. These two trees, for instance, assuming I'm drawing straight, have the same barcode. So that's definitely not injective. So how many trees do we have is the first question, and can we characterize it combinatorially, this inverse problem? So the answer is yes. That was kind of a spoiler before. So the first question of how many trees? The tree realization number of a barcode B is going to be the TRN, I will call it from now, is the product of the index of a bar, where the index of a bar is the number of bars it's included in. So to give you an example, here we can classify barcodes by permutation type. And if all the bars, so here the purple bar is included into all the previous one. So that's its index, it's 3. The index of the red one is 2. The index of the blue one is 1. And we obtain n factorial, here 3 factorial, which is 6 possible trees. I will explain that in a minute why we get this. And for the identity barcode, where when no bars are included into the previous one apart from the main branch, we have only 1 possible tree. And just to go back to phylogenetic trees for a second, if we want to define combinatorial phylogenetic trees, that means we forget this height function, then these 2 trees here are the same combinatorial phylogenetic trees, but they're different combinatorial merge trees. These 2 trees seem the same, and these 2 trees as well. So just for the people studying phylogenetic trees, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's an interesting fact, and there's more details in the paper that I will mention at the end on this. So to explain to you where this number comes from, I think this is a much better way to see what happens. If I start with this barcode and I want to reconstruct all the trees that have the same barcode, I will build the tree starting from the birth time. So here, so I add the main branch, the trunk, it's always there. And then I go on to the blue one. The blue one can only be attached to the black one because it's there. So we have this. Now the red one here, it's included into both the blue and the black bars. And using the elder rule, that means that the red branch can be attached to both the blue and the black. So you have two possibilities here. And similarly for the purple one, it's included in the blue and black. So you have two possibilities each time, but it cannot be attached to the red one because it would break the elder rule if you had something like this. So this is how, I mean, this is basically the proof that the trivialization number is really this index, this product of indices. And try to remember the snowflake because I will mention it again at the end of this talk. So this is another representation of this inverse problem, which I think is really nice because now that we know that we can use we can classify barcodes by permutation type, and we also know what kind of trees we have for each type. Well, you can basically take the Cayley graph of the symmetric group. So for those who don't remember, the Cayley graph, the vertices are the permutation, and then you go from one permutation to another via those two generators here, 1, 2, and 2, 3 transpositions. So again, this identity barcode has only one tree, and the one that have this sort of Russian doll behavior has 3 factorial, so 6 possible trees. So basically, the fiber of the persistent map depends only on the permutation type of barcode, which is really nice because this trivialization number can actually be computed from, again, I'm going a lot into the group theory here. So if some people don't know about this, it's fine, but it's actually the product of the inversion of permutation. So if you have the inversion vector, it's the product of the entries of this vector gives you the trivialization number. So the trivialization number also only depends on the permutation type of barcode. So we can completely solve the inverse problem using this symmetric group classification for barcodes. Now, one good thing is that this trivialization number can also be used as a statistic. So again, if we take the trivialization number, this barcode, which with the Russian doll behavior, where all the bars are included in the previous one, you have a trivialization number of n factorial. And that means you have a variety of possible trees that goes from this one, where all the branches are attached to the previous one. This can only be achieved by this barcode, but you could also have one where everything is attached to the main one. I have 3, yeah. Whereas for the trivialization number of 1, the identity barcode, then all the branches have to be attached to the main one. I messed up. This should be like this. So basically the trivialization number, if it's very low, means that potentially all the branches of the tree are attached to the trunk. Whereas if it's very high, you have more chances that your tree looks like this. And this we use to compare neurons to uniform distribution on the symmetric group. So now that we know we can classify barcode with a symmetric group, we can take a uniform distribution on that and compare the trivialization number of the uniform distribution on the symmetric group with neurons or any type of distribution of trees that you have. So here the neuron curve is the orange one. And we can see that it's much lower than so the randomized here is this uniform distribution. So it's lower than that. So neurons have a lower trivialization number. Sorry, this is the log of the trivialization number against the number of bars. So in general, neurons tend to have lower trivialization number, meaning they look more like an identity barcode than this one where this Russian doll barcode, basically. And the maximal one here in black is just the log of n factorial. And we can compute the trivialization number of the uniform distribution. This is the curve that we see here in blue, like can be computed to be this. So it's kind of nice to see that the symmetric group, I mean, the permutation associated to barcodes of neurons are not uniform, at least. You can also, another thing that we can do is just look at the permutation type of barcode. So this is really the neuron, the neuron permutation type. And so bifurcation order against termination order. And you can see that the neurons tend to be closer to the diagonal, meaning that 1 send to 1, 2 send to 2, 3 send to 3, and so on. So again, we have more something like the identity that looks like this, versus if we had something closer to here, we would have more 1 send to n, 2 send to n minus 1, and so on. So this Russian doll behavior. So again, that shows that neurons have this tendency to be closer to identity barcodes. So this is again the same plot as at the beginning, except that now we can classify barcodes by this permutation type. And then we can project that even further to n using the trivialization number, which is the cardinality of the fiber of the persistent map. So this is kind of a summary of where we are now. And as I said, there's a lot of group theory and combinatorial things that we can do using this symmetric group point of view now. So the trivialization number is not only the product of the inversion vectors entries, but it has a lot of properties related to the symmetric group. For instance, here, it increases with the Brura order. For those who don't know what the Brura order is, just think that the identity, if you take a path from the identity to this Russian doll barcode, then the trivialization number increases with that. So here you can see 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 18, 24. And any path from the identity to this, it will increase. So there's a lot of interesting properties, but the problem with this model using the Cayley graph and the symmetric group is that it's kind of discrete and lacks continuity, in the sense that, for instance, these two barcodes both have the identity permutations. So they're all here. So you have several barcodes within the same vertex. So we would like to get something a little bit more continuous, and think also what happens if you start switching to death. Intuitively, that would mean that you're kind of walking on an edge. If you're switching, here it's this one and this one, you're basically walking on this edge between the two vertices. So you have this sort of continuous change in the depth value, but that corresponds to one edge in the graph. So it lacks a little bit of continuity in the sense. And this is where something called the Coxster complex comes into place. Basically, for those who, I mean, probably most of you don't know what the Coxster complex is, but you can think of it as the dual of the permutohedron. So first, the permutohedron is an embedding of the Cayley graph. So the Cayley graph of Sn can always be embedded on an n-2 sphere, like here for S4. And the dual of this is called the Coxster complex. And it's very nice because now we have this Cayley graph where, again, each vertex has several barcodes associated to it, and we have no continuity. But if we take the dual now, instead of a vertex, we have an entire face corresponding to the permutation. So I will show you that in a second. Here it is. So now the identity permutation has an entire face here corresponding to it. So this is the Coxster complex. Basically, it's a triangulation of a sphere, and each of the higher dimensional faces correspond to a permutation in the symmetric group. And to go from, for instance, the permutation 2134 to 2314, you switch 1 and 3, and that corresponds to the reflection by a hyperplane if you really coordinatize this sphere in R3. It will really correspond to switching the two coordinates x1 and x3. I hope that makes sense. I will give you on the next slide an example in 3D. Sorry. So using the Coxster complex, we can coordinatize Rn, and then I will use this to give new coordinates on the space of barcodes. So let's first start with R3. So if I have R3 here, generated by E1, E2, E3, my first coordinate will be the projection on this line L here, which is spanned by 1, 1, 1. So it's the sum, it's E1 plus E2 plus E3. So if you project a vector X on this line, you will obtain the average of the coordinates. You will have X1 plus X2 plus X3 divided by 3. It's just a simple scalar product. Now, this is my first coordinate. It's the average of the coordinates. Now, the second and third coordinate will be on the orthogonal space to L, which you can see in green here. So now if we just look at what happens on this 2D, on this plane here, my second coordinate will not be a traditional Cartesian coordinate, but will be spherical coordinates. So the second coordinate is actually the radius of a sphere, here a circle. So it's the distance so this is the red line L. And now the radius of the sphere is the distance to this line. You can think of it here as well. And this easy computation will show you that it's the standard deviation of the coordinates. So that's really nice because we get two standard statistical tools, the average and the standard deviation, and they're just natural coordinates here. And my third coordinate will be now just the angular coordinate here, but I will forget about the angular coordinate and I will just remember that the Coxster complex is a triangulation of a sphere. Here, my circle basically can be also subdivided into those 6 permutations, and that also correspond to the hyperplanes that you can see as lines here. I hope I made myself clear. I know it's not super easy to see this at first, but basically using that, we obtain 3 coordinates for R3, makes sense. The first coordinate is the average of the xi. Second coordinate is the standard deviation, and third coordinate is this angular coordinate, which we'll forget and consider just the permutation associated to it. So we lose a little bit of information, but that's how we get back to this symmetric group relationship that I was talking to you from the beginning. So using that, we obtain a new geometric description of the space of barcodes with n bars. We also obtain a stratification of the space. So if I have Bn and I consider it as Rn for the birth, another copy of Rn for the death, intersection with Y is just to force that the birth are always smaller than the death. You don't want to be, you don't want to die before you're even born. So Bn is just this space quotiented by the symmetric group. It's not the same symmetric group than before. This is just a symmetric group that will permute all the. So I said at the beginning, a barcode is unordered. I mean, the pairs are not ordered. So this symmetric group forgets the order of the bars. Now, I just showed you how we can decompose R3 as this coordinates, this new coordinates. So basically, maybe let me go back to this. I didn't say here that we obtain a cone on a sphere times R, but basically you have a sphere, you cone it by taking this radius parameter, and then you do times R for this line L. So basically you have a correspondence between Rn and a cone on the sphere times R. So R2n this is the Coxster complex. So this is triangulation of the sphere. You have a cone of this times R, and then you have 2Rn. So you have 2 copies of this. And basically the result is that Bn is stratified. The stratification is really just induced by the simplices of the triangulation. So the highest dimensional strata are actually indexed by the symmetric group. And lower dimensional strata are indexed by parabolic subgroup of the symmetric group, but I didn't want to go into details. I will show you which paper this result corresponds to at the end. So if you're interested, you can have a look. So each stratum corresponds to a permutation type of barcode. The proof is really just looking at this decomposition, and then we have to check that it works well with the quotient of the symmetric group. So it's a little bit technical, but it's nothing much more complicated than what I just showed you before. And you do this for birth and death, and then you quotient this order and everything works well. So this is very nice because now we can use this symmetric group, the permutation associated to barcodes, to even understand the space of barcodes a little bit more. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is a lattice theoretic version of this inverse problem. So this is basically the same thing that I showed you at the beginning with this combinatorial characterization of the inverse problem. When you have merged trees and barcodes, you can basically just consider combinatorial merged trees and combinatorial barcodes to understand completely this inverse problem. Now we're just going to focus on the bottom part of this diagram, which is here. And I will explain to you how we get a correspondence between combinatorial merge trees and maximal chains in the partition lattice, and combinatorial barcodes and maximal chains in the subset lattice. So let me go through this little by little. So first, the partition lattice is, you can see an example here. It's basically you start with n singletons, and at each time you go up, you add, you merge 2 subset together. So here, for example, I merge 0 and 1 together, and I keep 2 as a singleton, and then I end up with 0, 1, 2 all together, because there's only 2 steps in this process for 0, 1, and 2. And each chain, maximal chain in this partition lattice, so a maximal chain, I start at the bottom element, and I just go up until I reach the top element. So maximal chain in this partition lattice will correspond to a combinatorial merge tree. For example, if I take this one here, basically 0, 1, and 2 here, they correspond to 3 leaves that are ordered by this indexing. So this is the birth label that I explained to you in the definition of combinatorial merge tree. And now if I merge the 2 singletons 0 and 1, it means that I merge the first branch with the 0th branch. So this is basically what happens here. The first branch is merged into the 0th one, and the second one, it's still a singleton in the lattice, so it's just a branch that is not merged with anything yet. And then I go to the last one, 0, 1, and 2 are all together. And so the second one merges with this other group, which is then 0 and 1. This is how I obtain this combinatorial merge tree. If I follow this one instead, then 1 and 2 become the same set here. So that corresponds, to this one here, where 2 merge into 1, and then they both merge into 0, and I obtain this merge tree, and this combinatorial merge tree, and similarly for the last one. Hope that's clear. Now let me just explain. So this is basically the snowflake process that I was telling you about a few slides ago. So if you remember it, it's just with 1 less bar, because the snowflake I was showing you before had the 6 branches, so it's becoming a bit large to make the correspondence with this here. Now the subset lattice is just considering all the subset of this set here, only 1, 2. And it's just the poset, so the order is just given by inclusion. So again, here it's quite simple for just 1, 2. You start with the empty set. You either have 1 or 2, and then you end up with just 1, 2 here. And again, a maximal chain in the subset lattice will correspond to a combinatorial barcode, which is just a permutation. So if I start with the empty set, I first take 1. That means that my first branch will stop first. And then the second branch will stop. So I end up with 1 sent to 1 and 2 sent to 2. If I take the other path, then the second branch stops first, the bar stops first. So I have 2 sent to 1, and then the first one dies second. So I have 2 sent to 1. I hope that's clear. And now it's something well known that the partition lattice covers the subset lattice. The covering here is just given by the colors. So the 2 green here cover this green path here, and the purple one covers this one. And what's really nice is that this covering, you also obtain an induced covering on the maximal chains. And this corresponds exactly to the tree realization number, to all the realizations, so to the fiber of the persistence map, so the combinatorial persistence map. So basically, these 2 trees here have this barcode, and this tree here has this barcode, and really the color they correspond well. So now we can completely understand this inverse problem by just looking at the 2 maximal chains in the partition lattice. So those 2 snowflakes, if you want. So just to summarize a little bit, we're trying to understand the relation between the spaces of trees and barcodes and combinatorially characterize this relation to build new statistical tools such as the TRN. We've used it to understand biological trees, so neurons, and how they differ from random tree structures. And that this relation with the symmetric group also allowed to give a new description of the space of barcodes using geometric group theory. And the last thing I showed you is how to use lattices to describe this inverse problem. And just to give a very little bit of future work. So the idea would be to fully understand the relationship between the spaces of trees and barcodes from this combinatorics and geometric group theory point of view. So this nice stratification that we obtain on the space of barcodes, it would be really nice to have it on merged trees. It's possible to do this on phylogenetic trees. There's a really nice decomposition of the phylogenetic tree space, but it doesn't work that well for merged trees, and merged trees are actually much more complicated than phylogenetic trees just because of this lack of extra labeling of the branches. It's actually the same thing than barcodes. If you label them by birth time, it becomes much easier to work with than if you have to quotient by this order of the bars. So basically, maybe what we understand from the barcode space now could help to also understand merged trees a little bit better. And that will allow also to pull back statistical tools from one space to another. Something just as simple as an average is really hard to define on merged trees. So maybe understanding this relationship a little bit better could help for that. And it would be also nice to be able to use this understanding to generate artificial neurons. So that's maybe more of an application from artificial barcodes, because something I didn't really have time to mention today is that you can start from the barcode of a neuron and generate artificial neurons that look a lot like the first one. But you have to start from a biological barcode to do that. But if we understand this relationship between the 2 spaces better, then we might be able to start from artificial barcodes and just do the same process. So with that, I would like to thank you again for your attention and thank all my collaborators. And so, as I said at the beginning, it's a bit of a combination of a few papers. So here are all the papers I mentioned today. And thank you very much.
Thank you. So maybe I would ask everyone to unmute themselves and give a round of applause for Adélie. Okay, so now it's time for questions. If you have a question, just unmute yourself or raise your hand.
I have a question that, so this is super cool. My question is, if you've had a chance to look at any like non-mammalian cells. I'm currently looking at the fly brain, and it turns out that insect neurons are very wild and crazy compared to like pyramidal cells. Pyramidal cells are nice, whereas just like here's a soma, here's a tree. I mean, they're still tree, but they're still tree structures, but they're very different. So I was wondering if you had a chance to look at anything other than mammalian cells.
So the expert in neuroscience is Lida, and she's the one who's been providing the data of the Blue Brain project and really doing the more neuroscience applications. So I know she's been using this trivialization number, and she's been doing lots of other experiments on different types of neurons, but I don't remember on the top of my head which type of cells she used. I used, yeah, honestly, the name of the cell right now, I can't really tell you, I'm sorry, but I can have a look later if you're interested, and you can just, if you're really interested in looking at this, they have more neuroscience applied papers. I can send them to you if you'd like.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question, Adélie. So in your plots with the, symmetric group, you had a model that was the randomized bio model. Could you say again what that was?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to go through it, but it's basically you take the values of the neuron barcodes and you just shuffle them around to get a new barcode. So you keep the same values, but they're not paired the same way.
I see. So it's coming from the data set.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah, exactly.
And interesting when you do this, you get further away than just the range.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's again that shows, I don't know, again, I'm really not an expert in neuroscience, but for me, that really shows that those values somehow, it's not only the values of the function, because basically the birth and death, they really correspond to the values of the function, but the adjacency, so the way they're matched or they're paired basically also matters, because if you start shuffling them around, then it doesn't work anymore. So it's not only the values of the position, but it's also how they're paired, which again shows shows a little bit this interest in the symmetric group that we have, because it's really how those are paired together.
Let me cheat and ask a second question while you're here. So you're working in the generic setting, so you don't have like endpoints collide or things like this. But I was curious if you all had brainstormed variants of the tree realization number that are not always integers, but maybe also take into account, lengths of bars and things like that. And yeah.
So the tree realization number, you could define it for equal values, but the thing is with real data, it doesn't really happen. Like you never have two endpoints or bifurcation point of a neuron that have the same value. But this is basically what this Coxster complex representation does. So I didn't want to go in the details of what happens with the lower dimensional strata, but it's exactly when you have two equal values. So here, for instance, on the blue, you have x2 equals to x3. So if you want the second and third depth are equal on this strata. And here you have x3 equals to x4, x2 equals to x3, and what's the last one? x2 equals to x4. Is that the one I forgot to mention? Yeah, anyway. So this is what happened for the barcodes. And then for the trees, well, you could also define this sort of inverse by just decide, you just have to make a decision whether it's included or not when they have equal values, but you could do the same process for that and define the tree realization number in the same way. And that's why I think it would be kind of interesting, because that would really see this. So basically, to go back to this relation with the phylogenetic tree space, actually don't know if I have this slide, but I think I do have. Nope. Yeah, I think it's this. Whoop. No, where is it? Yeah. Oh, never mind. Forget this. Sorry. Yeah. So basically, if you take the label given by here ABC and ABC, which is arbitrary, so that would be the phylogenetic label, then you have a continuous change in the phylogenetic tree space. But if you take the label inherited by the height function, then between those two trees, you just have a small change here. So this one becomes lower and this one here becomes higher. And this is discontinuous. So basically, as combinatorial merge trees, these two are not equivalent. But in the phylogenetic tree space, they're really not far apart. So again, that's why everything is so different between phylogenetic trees and merge trees. And I think that trying to basically take the stratification that we have on barcodes, because this is exactly studying when you have two things that switch and you have to go through this lower dimensional strata when two things are equal, then it's kind of the same thing than this change in the length of the branches as well. So now we're trying to just see if we can extend that to trees, but it's actually very complicated, unfortunately. I hope that answers your question.
Definitely, very cool.
I know.
Thanks.
Okay, do we have more questions?
May I ask you a question?
Of course.
Thank you. A nice talk. Regarding your first research problem, that translating something in the space of barcode back to in the space of this merged tree, do you have any idea? I mean, you wanted to generalize this merged tree, or is you stay with this merged tree and you wanted to know more about it? What is the idea? For example, we can generalize something like have a pairs of merged tree to back to a pairs of merged tree or something like that. Or maybe a generalization of merged tree to something like that, merge graph. Do you have any idea for your first research problem, or just a rough idea?
So I'm not sure I understand what you mean by a pair of merge trees, but if you're, so here I really focused only on the tree to barcodes problem, because that was just already a complicated enough inverse problem. But there is a bunch of work on the fiber of the persistent map in general, where people have used not only trees, but any type of topological space and consider the barcodes of these. And so I haven't studied that a lot, so I hope I won't say anything wrong, but basically, when you look at the fiber of this persistent map, sometimes you want to add maybe one cycle, so that means you have a tube going around, or maybe you have a sphere somewhere. And I think there should be a relation between the merge tree and then you start gluing cells along this merge tree, sort of, and maybe that would make a link between these works and the work on tree and barcodes that I've just explained now. I don't know if that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much.
Cool.
More questions?
Hello.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, all.
Hi.
Can I ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I have, I think, a simple question. I don't know if, from what I understand, is your research is from trees. You transform the data on trees to barcodes. and fourth, right?
Mm-hmm.
You transform from tree to barcode, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you made mention in your presentation, like you lose some information when doing the transition from the tree to barcodes.
Yeah, so the information you lose is really the adjacency of your tree. So a merge tree is, as I said, it's a combinatorial tree with this height function. And basically, when you go from a tree here to a barcode, the information you lose is which branch is attached where. So it's really the adjacency of the combinatorial tree that you lose.
Yeah. So my own question is like you are trying to have like an inverse of what you do, coming back from barcode back to trees.
Mm-hmm.
So my own question is how insignificant is the information you lose when you are coming back from barcode back to trees? Do you consider that?
Yeah, so that's exactly what this tree realization number gives you. If the tree realization number, so that is this relationship with the symmetric group. So if you have the identity permutation, then going from a tree to a barcode, you lose no information because you know that all the bars have to be attached to the main branch, so the trunk. But if you have a tree realization number that is really high, then that allows you to quantify how much information you lost because you know that maybe you have at most n factorial possible trees that have the same barcode. So that's also a good thing is the tree realization number really quantifies how much information you lost. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's only my fear. How you quantify the information coming back.
Yeah, sorry if that was not clear. This is exactly the role of this tree realization number indeed. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions?
I just had a real quick question. You mentioned that in the Cayley graph, the tree realization number was monotonic with some sort of order, and I just didn't hear which order.
Mm-hmm. The Brewer order. It's
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's really, I mean, I think the simplest way to see it is as increasing a monotonic path from the identity to the Russian doll. So the 4, 3, 2, 1 permutation, basically. The Brewer order is just how far from the identity permutation you are. So how many times you switched two elements. How you can,
I just didn't hear it the first time.
I had to go back to a lot of my lecture notes and group theory when we started making all these observations.
Do we have more questions? Okay, so in case not, thanks Adélie again for your wonderful talk, and I'm going to stop the recording.